Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I wanted to talk to you about some of the books that I've been reading recently, including some of the books that I read last month for Nonfiction November. But first I want to talk about a couple of books that I read from the Dalkey Press Archives Library of Korean Literature series. And the first of those is PAVANE for a Dead Princess by Park Min-gyu, which I recently did a full review on, so I'm going to link that down below if you want to check it out. And in case the title of this book didn't give you any hints as to what the actual story is about, this novel is set in Seoul, South Korea over the winter of 1985 to 1986, and it follows the brief and cautious romance between a handsome young parking lot attendant and the extremely ugly department store girl that he falls for. But beyond simply telling this rather unconventional love story, the book also critiques the materialism, the harsh beauty standards, and the general superficiality of post-war Korean society, looking closely at the social and emotional costs of that country's rapid modernization. Its characters also wrestle with a sort of urban malaise and all of the agony and ecstasy of youth and first love, and the book also takes a kind of sharp turn in the last 30 pages or so that's one of those endings that kind of makes you want to go back and read the whole book all over again. So yeah, I really loved this book. It's a late contender for one of my favorite books of the year, so I'm going to link my full review down below if you want to hear more about it. I also read No One Writes Back by Jang Eun-jin, which deals in its own way with the loneliness and alienation in modern Korea. I don't know if those themes of despondency and disconnection are common in a lot of contemporary Korean lit, but they were certainly central questions of both of these books. It follows a man in his 30s who has been on a 3-year journey of sorts, traveling around the country with his dog Wajo and staying in a different motel every night. It's a meandering sort of trip, and as this narrator journeys around and meets and talks to different people, he assigns each person a number in his head, and then he goes back to his motel of the day and pulls out a piece of paper and writes each person a letter, always with the hope that someday one of them will write back. And this seems to epitomize how disconnected people have become in the digital age, to the extent that this narrator is trying to reduce whole individuals down to cold and impersonal numerals, and yet that very analog act of taking out a piece of paper and a pen and writing a physical letter to someone seems to suggest a sort of desperate desire for real, tangible, and meaningful connection. And I found that to be a really intriguing premise, especially because as this character travels along, we get some flashbacks and some insights into the reasons behind this quest he's taking. Unfortunately, about 30 pages into this book, he encounters a rather odd and similarly itinerant woman who kind of starts trailing him around and forces her way into his company. And I was hoping that that was going to be a kind of brief encounter in a series of encounters, but then the book unfortunately becomes kind of the story of their reluctant friendship as fellow wayfarers, which I found just less interesting than what the original setup had promised. It kind of had some lonely person makes a friend vibes that were in Eleanor Oliphant, which I didn't particularly enjoy, and overall the whole book just ended up being a little bit more trite and feel good than I was expecting. And I also thought that the ending wasn't as surprising or as revelatory as Jang probably intended it to be. So this book was fine, but it wasn't nearly as good as I was hoping it was going to be, so overall it didn't leave that much of an impression. But getting into some of the nonfiction that I read last month, I read Good and Mad: The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger by Rebecca Traister, and in this book Rebecca Traister really tries to take stock of the cultural and political moment that we find ourselves in, looking at the events leading up to the 2016 election and then at the 2 years since then. And she also tries to situate this particular moment in a long history of women's activism and anger, which has often gotten short shrift in American history textbooks, but which has played a significant role in our politics nevertheless. And Traister isn't a reporter or an academic in the traditional sense, so this is less a book of groundbreaking new information or cutting-edge studies and more an aggregation of a lot of the history of women's anger and a lot of the current news around women's anger in America, all compiled in one place for easy consumption. And to some extent, I do think this book's greatest utility is the extent to which it is a cathartic read for people trying to comprehend the moment that we're living in, particularly if you are an angry woman, because the way that this book holds up that anger and acknowledges it and suggests that it is sometimes a good and powerful tool of resistance feels very validating and affirmative. And she really makes an effort throughout all of this to make this book as intersectional as possible. And for the most part, I think she's quite successful at that. And she really does a good job of acknowledging how some women face greater consequences for expressing anger publicly than other women. Prior to reading Good and Mad, I also read All the Single Ladies, Unmarried Women, and the Rise of an Independent Nation by Rebecca Traister, which has been out for a couple of years, and I've had my eye on it for a while, but to be completely honest, I picked it up shortly after not one but two of my friends asked me to be a bridesmaid in their upcoming weddings, and I am super happy for them and excited and looking forward to that, but it also did kind of set off like an uncharacteristic existential panic about my own personal life. So yeah, I mostly picked up this book to like reaffirm my own life choices and like the value of being independent and hashtag female friendship and all that good stuff. But I did find it to be a really interesting read as well. It was quite thorough and good at acknowledging the very real challenges of being a single woman in America and how society is often not structured to support single women. Overall, I really enjoyed this read. I found it once again very cathartic and comforting, so thank you, Rebecca Traister, for that. And I did really like the argument that she made about how the longer we as a society put off marriage, the more independent we all become, men and women alike, so that when people eventually do partner up, those partnerships are more equitable because, you know, everyone knows how to do their own laundry. So that's great. I also recently finished reading Bloods, Black Veterans in the Vietnam War, an Oral History by Wallace Terry, which I was interested in reading after I finished The Things They Carried and The Sorrow of War. Wallace Terry was a journalist and bureau chief on the ground in Vietnam in the late 1960s, and in this book he interviews 20 different Black veterans about their experiences during the war. And I'm not sure how exactly he interviewed these men or what his questions were or what his methodology was, but whatever he was able to do, he elicited a very rich and varied collection of stories and memories and perspectives on the war. Because beyond these men all experiencing some level of racial discrimination, they really comprise a pretty diverse group, and they represent men from different parts of the country, different age brackets, and different levels of military experiences. So it's fascinating on that level because you get a much richer and more layered and granular look at the war, and the texture of the war feels different in every chapter of this book depending on who's telling the story. That being said, many of the stories in this book are quite grim, and there are some descriptions of bodily trauma in this book that are some of the most disturbing I've encountered in any literature. And a lot of these men also faced significant challenges when they returned to America after the war, but there are also these kind of unexpected moments of triumph and joy. I'm thinking in particular of the story of a man named Robert Mountain, who went home from Vietnam as an amputee and then went on to become an extremely successful amputee track racer, which is the type of stuff that you just can't make up. So I don't know that I would recommend this book to the average reader because it is quite slow and there's no real narrative flow to it, but if you're interested in the Vietnam War specifically, then I would say it is a must read and a really rewarding one at that. I also recently read Becoming by Michelle Obama, which I feel like there isn't a whole lot left to say about because it has quickly become the most popular book in America, but I really enjoyed it. It's a book that's split between her early life, her life with Barack, and then her life in the public eye as the First Lady. And as many people have commented, I found the earlier chapters about her childhood growing up on the south side of Chicago, her years as a Princeton undergraduate and then her blossoming romance with Barack to be some of the most revealing and interesting sections of the book. And like a lot of people have said, I thought the chapters about her and Barack falling in love read almost like a romance novel. I mean, she doesn't idealize their relationship and is very open about talking about how they've been to couples counseling, etc. But you still get a sense of how these two people are truly in love. And there is a passage where she's still kind of trying to decide if she's romantically interested in him, and they go to like a work barbecue or something, and she's watching him play a pickup basketball game and is just like struck by how like handsome and like elegant he looks. So I loved that. And I saw Rincey from Rincey Reads say on Goodreads that Michelle and Barack are her OTP, and I completely agree. But I do think the book becomes slightly less interesting as we move into Barack's political career and as Michelle sort of takes on a more public role. Those sections sound a little bit more like a rehash of the Obama administration and a defense of her and her husband's legacy, and it just feels more formal and public and political than the more personal earlier sections of the book. And I do kind of wonder if those years of her life are still a bit too fresh to completely have processed, so I'll be curious to see what she has to say about that time of her life kind of 10 or 20 years down the line. But overall, I really enjoyed it. It was a super comforting read. I love Michelle Obama, and if you love Michelle Obama, I'm sure you've already bought this book. Lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite, and this book is quite short. It's almost more of a novella than a novel, and it's set in Lagos, Nigeria, and it follows a woman named Korede whose beautiful younger sister, Ayola, keeps killing the men that she's dating. So it's all quite twisted, and then things come to a head when Ayola starts dating a handsome doctor who Korede works with and who she is secretly in love with. So that is like a rich, juicy, dare I say delicious premise for a book, and it's a real bummer that the actual story is completely flavorless. It like turns to dust the second it hits your tongue, and I've been trying to figure out where this book went wrong. That setup and the short page count gives Braithwaite opportunities to take the story in a very campy direction or to go very dark and comedic. I'm thinking of Convenience Store Woman as an example of another short book that kind of eschews realism in favor of something more biting and satirical. She also could have just gone very dark and thrillery in a more traditional genre sense, but she doesn't do any of that. Instead, this book reads as much more straightforward literary fiction that's much more character-driven than plot-driven, but ultimately I don't think Braithwaite gives herself enough space to fully flesh out any of those characters or relationships. It made me think of Jane Steele by Lindsay Fay, which is another book about a woman who ends up killing a lot of men, but I thought that book was much more successful at explaining its characters' actions and psychology in a nuanced way while still having fun with the pulpy premise. And in contrast, the characters in this book kind of fall flat and always feel very one-dimensional, and we never really get any insight into Ayola's relationships with the men that she kills, and the plot as a whole feels very flimsy and rushed and unsatisfying. So yeah, not a huge fan of this book. I don't really recommend it, but I also know that it is quite buzzy right now. So if you have read this book and enjoyed it, I would be super curious to hear your thoughts about why. But otherwise, those are all the books that I've been reading recently. If you've read any of these books and have thoughts of them, let me know what you think down below, or feel free to tell me about some of the books you've been reading to kind of round out your 2018. As always, thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye!